"Please let me in, I'm freezing," pleaded the homeless man. Then the disguised millionaire CEO did this. It was a cold night. The biting breeze cut through the deserted streets of Los Angeles, and in the midst of that harsh winter, a homeless man named David shivered as he walked along the sidewalk. His body was exhausted, and his eyes, empty of hope, were fixed on the door of a sophisticated restaurant, Lux Beastro. He approached, teeth chattering and his voice hoarse, pleading, "Please let me in, I'm freezing." Inside the restaurant, the manager, Chris, looked through the window with a sarcastic smile, and with no mercy, walked to the door. When he opened it, he looked at David, still trembling. "You don't belong here," he said curtly. "Get lost before I call the cops." David, with slumped shoulders and a broken spirit, stood still, trying to understand why the world treated him this way. When the manager went back inside, he knelt down in front of the door, searching for at least a bit of warmth from within the restaurant. But there was no gesture of compassion. The winter seemed to swallow everything. What David didn't know was that sitting at a table in the corner of the restaurant watching everything was Alexander Grant, the millionaire CEO of Lux Beastro. Disguised as an ordinary customer, with a hoodie up and sunglasses on, he quietly observed every move. Alexander had chosen a simple disguise, wanting to see the true nature of his restaurant. He wanted to know if the soul of his establishment was still alive, if people were still treated with humanity, or if coldness had taken over. And as he watched the scene, something in Alexander broke. Standing up from his table, he walked over to the manager, Chris, and said firmly, "You have no right to treat anyone like that. Everyone deserves respect, especially those who are most vulnerable." With a simple motion, Alexander stepped away from Chris and walked over to David. The homeless man, now with tears in his eyes from the humiliation, barely noticed the millionaire standing beside him. Alexander, speaking softly, said, "I'm Alexander Grant. This is my restaurant. And you, David, are worth more than you think. Come with me." Before we dive back into this touching story, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment. Now let's continue the story. The night fell heavily over the streets of Los Angeles, and the cutting wind seemed to cut through the layers of clothing of anyone daring to be outside. It was the kind of night where loneliness made itself felt, even in the simplest things, like the sound of footsteps on the cold asphalt. However, for David, the night was not just cold, it was a battlefield. He walked with hesitant steps, head down and shoulders hunched. His body was thin, not just from lack of food, but from the weight of a difficult life, marked by losses, abandonment, and pain. But the cold, oh, the cold, seemed to be his greatest enemy. He could feel his bones aching with each step. The skin of his hands was cracked and dry from exposure to the elements, and his nose, red from constant sniffing, made him lose track of where he was. The world seemed to have forgotten him, and it became clearer with every corner he passed. With every imposing building that rose in front of him, it was as if the buildings were cruelly smiling, mocking his misery. The sidewalk was his only company, a simple piece of concrete, empty, solitary, and relentless. Yet, he continued his journey, slow steps, as if he knew the end of his walk had not yet come. Then, amid the darkness of that cold night, he saw something that caught his attention, a restaurant with twinkling lights from the inside, cozy and elegant, contrasting with the darkness outside. Its striking appearance seemed to offer warmth that he didn't even believe he deserved. Lux Beastro. The name felt so distant from his reality. He looked at the glass door, through which he could see people inside laughing and enjoying their meals. "Please let me in. I'm freezing," he thought to himself. He didn't expect luxury nor special treatment. Just a place where he could warm up, where he could, even if for a brief moment, feel that he wasn't completely alone. David hesitated, feeling the pain in his feet and joints, and then slowly approached the entrance. The automatic doors didn't open immediately, and he dragged himself as far as he could, not knowing how he would be received. His gaze swept over the tables, trying to find some sign of compassion, something that indicated he wouldn't be immediately thrown out. Then with a hoarse voice he asked, as if pleading for a small crumb of humanity, "Please let me in, I'm freezing." It was a simple request, but laden with a pain that crossed the boundaries of understanding. He just wanted an opportunity, a gesture of mercy. However, when the door finally opened, he was confronted with something he didn't expect. The restaurant manager, Chris, appeared in front of him. With a merciless look, he glanced up and down at David. The smile that formed on his face was not one of compassion. It was a cold, sarcastic smile, as if the man in front of him didn't deserve to be in that luxurious environment. David, still shivering from the cold, tried to take a step forward, but was immediately stopped. "You don't belong here," said Chris with a tone of superiority. The manager's voice sounded like a death sentence. "If you're not here to eat, then leave. We're not offering shelter." What could have been a simple act of kindness turned into a public humiliation. David felt the words pierce his skin more than the cold itself. He wasn't a customer, he wasn't a human being, he was just an unwanted presence. Without a word, he took a step back, trying to control the tears that were stubbornly starting to form. The humiliation was too much. But before he could turn his back and disappear into the night, something made him stop. Something he couldn't immediately identify. He looked back at the door of Lux Beastro, as if the answer he was looking for was inside. It was then that he noticed the figure sitting at one of the tables, watching with attention every move he made. Ethan Grant was a discreet man, appearing as an ordinary customer. He was sitting alone with a glass of wine in front of him, but his eyes were fixed on David. He didn't seem rushed, nor eager to finish his meal. His eyes were calm but penetrating, as if seeing beyond the surface. Something about Ethan caught David's attention. But before he could think any further, Chris turned his attention back to him, saying sharply, "I've already told you to leave. Now don't make me call security." The manager's voice was as firm as the night's cold, and David knew he didn't have much time before being completely thrown out. He was about to turn around, but a movement from Ethan interrupted his thoughts. The CEO stood up from his table and silently walked over to where the manager was. Without making a scene, he approached Chris with a calmness that was almost unsettling. Something was about to happen, and David could barely understand the magnitude of what was about to be revealed. The cold night seemed to intensify as the minutes passed. The biting wind made the lights of Lux Beastro flicker slightly, as if they were dancing shyly, a reminder of the cruel world outside. However, inside the restaurant, everything was calm, refined, with an air of carefree elegance that seemed to envelop all of its customers. And yet, at the center of it all, there was a man, David, homeless, hungry, hopeless, trying to connect with something more human. But his attempt to seek compassion was quickly thwarted. The response he received from Chris, the manager, was not only a refusal of his request, but a public humiliation. "You don't belong here," he had said, with the tone of someone who had already decided the man's fate before even knowing him. There was no hesitation in his voice, no room for empathy, just disdain. David stood there, looking down, as the wind made his teeth chatter harder. The manager's indifference became even more evident as he turned his back and walked away from the homeless man. Chris went back inside the restaurant, slamming the door shut in a gesture that seemed to symbolize the closing of any possibility of humanity in that moment. David, with his shoulders slumped and his soul already shattered, looked at the dark street ahead of him, feeling the weight of rejection once more. He was so used to being ignored, to being treated as invisible, that the pain of humiliation was not new, but still, it cut deep. How could it have been different? How could someone like him, a homeless man, nameless, worthless in society's eyes, deserve to be treated any other way? The cold seemed to invade his soul more than his body. But while he stood there, trembling, with erratic breathing, Ethan Grant, the real owner of the restaurant, was watching it all from the back of the room. Sitting at a discreet table, he made no noise, caused no commotion, but his eyes were firmly fixed on David. He was, in fact, seeing something that no one else was. Ethan, with his tailored suit and impeccable posture, seemed like an ordinary man at first glance. His gaze observed the scene with deep interest, as if he were analyzing something that transcended the mere appearance of an interaction between a customer and an employee. He wasn't just watching David like any other spectator. There was something more in his perception, something that made him feel connected to the situation. When David was roughly pushed away by Chris, Ethan didn't just feel a wave of discomfort, but also a deep inner unease. What he had just witnessed disturbed him profoundly. He couldn't ignore the silent pain of that man any longer. He felt deep down that something more was happening here, something that transcended the immature behavior of a cruel manager and touched a deeper, more visceral human point. Meanwhile, Chris returned to his post, resuming his tasks as if nothing had happened. He didn't notice Ethan's serious and introspective look, who, now standing, moved away from his table and walked toward where the manager was. His imposing, yet silent presence was enough to make Chris turn, surprised that the CEO was approaching so quickly. "Chris," Ethan began, with absolute calm in his voice. "What just happened here is not acceptable." His voice had the power to change the atmosphere. There was no anger, but immense tension in the air, as if he knew something that Chris hadn't yet grasped. "How could you treat that man like that?" Ethan questioned. Chris, who until then had felt comfortable in his authority within the restaurant, now hesitated. He had been confronted by his boss but wasn't sure how to respond. There was no way to justify what he had done, yet he still tried to defend himself. "He wasn't here to eat, Ethan," Chris tried to argue, shaking his head as if it were a valid explanation. "I was just following the restaurant's rules." Ethan looked at Chris with an expression that clearly showed he was unimpressed. "Rules? You think following the rules justifies treating a human being as if they were invisible? How can you work in a place like this and not understand what's at stake here?" Chris swallowed hard. He had never seen Ethan so serious, so impersonal. He didn't know what to do with the reprimand he was receiving, but before he could find the words to defend himself, Ethan continued, with a calmness that contrasted with the intensity of the moment. "I want you to understand something, Chris. This restaurant isn't just about serving food or making a profit. It's about serving people, giving something of value, something that transforms lives. And today, you did the exact opposite. You didn't just fail as a manager, you failed as a human being. There's no place for that here. No place." The manager stood in silence, aware that the reprimand he was receiving was not just professional. It was personal. Ethan had touched a part of him that he preferred to ignore, but that now could no longer be avoided. As Chris stood there speechless, Ethan looked once again at David, who was still standing outside, looking at the ground. A decision was already forming inside him, and with every second he contemplated that lonely figure, his compassion grew. The restaurant was quieter now. The soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of wine glasses were like background music, as Ethan Grant, with his impeccable posture, walked away from Chris, the manager. The atmosphere was still charged, but no one seemed to notice the growing tension between them. However, for Chris, Ethan's words had been a shock. He didn't know exactly what to do with what he had just heard, but one thing was clear. He never imagined that someone, let alone his own boss, would reprimand him in such a way. Ethan walked to the restaurant's door, where David was still standing, head lowered. The homeless man, as if already accustomed to rejection, didn't even notice the CEO approaching. Ethan didn't mind the curious glances from other customers or the distant murmurs of the waiters. He had something to do, and nothing else mattered at the moment. He stopped beside David, looking at him with an expression of deep understanding. In the depths of his eyes, Ethan saw the story David carried. A story of struggle, of fall, and of resilience. The pain was something Ethan couldn't heal with words, but he knew that a simple gesture could change everything. "You are worth more than you think, David," Ethan said straightforwardly, but with a gentleness that contrasted with the coldness of the surroundings. David lifted his head, surprised, as if he wasn't used to being treated with dignity. He looked at Ethan for a moment, but the words of gratitude that were about to come from his mouth died before he could say them. He didn't know what to say, but something inside him started to awaken. A feeling of hope, long dormant, began to form, like a small point of light in the midst of darkness. As Ethan looked at David, he knew what needed to be done. Something had to be done to change the trajectory of this man's life. He turned, looked at Chris, who was just a few steps away, and then made a decision that would transform everything. Ethan walked toward Chris, and the change in his posture was clear. The calmness of before had been replaced by an almost threatening firmness. His voice no longer sounded soft but commanding, as though he wasn't just criticizing but asserting what was right. "Chris," he began, "do you think you have the right to humiliate people? To push them away like they're garbage? This restaurant is mine, and as long as I'm in charge, no one will be treated like that." Chris didn't respond immediately, but the shame was evident on his face. He had been caught off guard, and now found himself in the uncomfortable position of facing the truth he had been ignoring. His posture, once arrogant, was now shaky. He knew he couldn't escape Ethan's words, which now felt like a sentence. "You have no idea the impact your actions cause, Chris," Ethan continued, his voice full of calm authority. "What happened here today isn't just a failure of service, it's a human failure, and you need to understand that." Chris started to stammer, trying to justify himself, but Ethan didn't allow space for excuses. He wasn't there to hear justifications. He wanted to see change. He wanted to ensure that something as simple as respect and compassion became integral parts of that environment. "Chris," Ethan said, his voice becoming even firmer, "I'm giving you a chance to learn and grow as a human being. I'm not just the CEO of Lux Beastro. I'm someone who believes that everyone, no matter who they are, deserves a chance. You won't be part of this restaurant if you keep acting this way." The tension was thick in the air, but contrary to what Chris expected, Ethan didn't fire him in that moment. Instead, he challenged him to become a better person. It wasn't about losing his job. It was about losing his dignity over a simple act of kindness. Ethan wanted to see if there was something within Chris that could be redeemed. Chris stood in silence looking at Ethan. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if this was a second chance or just a silent criticism of his lack of character. But something inside him stirred. Something he never imagined was still there. The will to be better. Meanwhile, David watched from a distance, still speechless. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but Ethan's actions were doing something inside him. It was like he was witnessing a miracle unfold before his eyes. "David," Ethan said, turning to him once more, his voice soft, "you don't have to sleep on the streets anymore. You have more to offer the world than you think. I'm going to give you an opportunity, a chance to start over." David looked at Ethan with a surprised expression. He felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders, but he also knew he was about to step into unfamiliar territory. He didn't know what Ethan wanted from him, but he knew that this was more than he could ever have dreamed of. Ethan continued, with a gentle yet firm smile. "You'll be the new manager of Lux Beastro." He paused, watching David's reaction. "This restaurant is going to change. It's going to become a place where everyone is welcome no matter who they are. I want you to help transform other people's lives. Let's do this together." David didn't know how to respond. He was speechless, but more than anything, he felt gratitude. He knew that this would be the chance that would change his life forever. A chance he never imagined he would have. The restaurant was now in a tense silence, the atmosphere charged with a kind of expectation. As Ethan Grant looked at David, the homeless man, with his weary expression and incredulous eyes, the scene seemed to transform before his eyes. What should have been an ordinary night of operations at Lux Beastro was now becoming something much bigger, something that transcended the golden walls of the restaurant and penetrated the hearts of everyone present. David was still there, standing at the door as if left in a state of confusion, unsure how to react. Ethan's words had been so unexpected that he couldn't process them right away. He looked down, as if waiting for the ground to swallow his pain and doubts. Ethan's invitation was clear, but the offer of a new life seemed too surreal to be true. It was then that Ethan, sensing David's hesitation, approached with serene calmness. He knew that a man like David couldn't simply be thrown into a new life without more thought. He needed to understand the emotional impact this change could cause, the weight of the words he had just spoken. "David, look at me," Ethan said, with a softness in his voice that contradicted the rigidity of his business posture. "I know this all feels unreal. I know you must be wondering if you can trust me, if this isn't just another empty promise. And I understand. I know life hasn't been fair to you." David, still hesitant, lifted his eyes to Ethan. He had heard so many promises throughout his life, promises that were never kept, that now he could only look at Ethan with a mix of disbelief and skepticism. His experiences with society had taught him to doubt the goodness of others, to always expect the worst. "You don't know what it's like to live on the streets, Ethan," David began, his voice hoarse but full of undeniable truth. "People look at you like you're invisible. You feel the weight of their disdain and indifference every second. They judge you without knowing your story. I started to believe maybe this is my life. Maybe I did something so wrong that I now have to pay for it." Ethan listened to David's words carefully, absorbing everyone. He knew that David's words weren't just a lament but a cry of hopelessness. They were a reflection of the pain accumulated over the years, a pain that he could never fully understand, but now felt deep in his soul. "David," Ethan replied, his voice now firmer, "I'm not going to give you false promises. I don't know everything you've been through, but I know you have the power to change your life. What I'm offering you isn't charity, but an opportunity. An opportunity for you to use the experience you already have to help others." David looked at Ethan with a confused expression. He didn't understand. How could someone like him, a man who had fallen so far, have anything to offer? How could he, who spent his days fighting for survival, be worthy of a position of responsibility in a luxury restaurant? "But I'm not who I used to be," David replied, his voice trembling. "I was a restaurant manager, yes. But that was so long ago, Ethan. Things have changed, I've changed, I don't know how to go back to being who I was." Ethan smiled gently, as if he had heard this before. He knew David's resistance wasn't just about doubt, but fear. The fear of failing again. The fear of trying and being disappointed once more. "I understand your fear," Ethan said, "but that's exactly why I believe in you. You have a unique experience. You know what it's like to be the one who cleans, who organizes, who works tirelessly behind the scenes. You know the value of hard work, patience, and empathy. These are qualities you don't find just anywhere, and that's exactly what I need. You've been a leader, David. I want you to be one again. But this time, it won't just be about the job. It'll be about making a difference in the lives of others like you." David still seemed skeptical, but something in Ethan's words was beginning to resonate inside him. He looked at Ethan with a new kind of curiosity, a kind of curiosity he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if destiny had given him a chance and he was afraid to accept it. "You don't have to do this alone," Ethan continued, sensing David's inner struggle. "I'm offering you more than just a job. I'm offering you a key role, not just here at the restaurant, but in something much bigger. Lux Beastro can be more than just a luxury restaurant. We can turn it into a place where anyone from any background can find a home, and you could be the key to that. I trust you." These words began to break down the walls of resistance that David had built over the years. He didn't know what the future held, but the idea of being more than a homeless man, of being someone who could contribute and make a difference, was something he never imagined he would experience. For a moment, David remained silent, contemplating Ethan's words. He knew that accepting this offer would mean more than just a new job. It would mean a new beginning and a new path toward his own recovery and redemption. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked at Ethan. "I accept," David said, his voice now more firm, more resolute. "I want to try. I want to help." Ethan smiled. It was the beginning of something big, something transformative, not just for David, but for everyone involved. The journey was just beginning. David's decision was made. Something inside him had changed, even if imperceptibly to others. As Ethan Grant walked away from David, the homeless man, a new horizon opened up before him. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but there was something in his heart telling him that he couldn't go back. He wasn't just accepting a job, he was accepting a chance to transform his life, to become someone again. But what David didn't know was that what Ethan was about to reveal to him would change not only his life, but the fate of many others as well. Ethan's steps were firm as he walked away from David. The restaurant was beginning to regain its tranquility, but something in the air felt different. Perhaps it was the new purpose that was now forming in Ethan's words. Perhaps it was simply the fact that, in that moment, the people present in Lux Beastro were beginning to realize that something grand was about to happen. David, still absorbing the impact of what he had just accepted, followed Ethan to the back of the restaurant. He didn't quite know what to expect, but there was something captivating in Ethan's unshakable calm, something that made things seem possible. "Are you ready to begin?" Ethan asked with a subtle smile, full of genuine confidence that seemed to shine through every word. "Because what I have to offer you isn't just a job, it's a new life." David looked at him, still with a bit of distrust, but now with more clarity in his eyes. He knew he was about to embark on something he had never imagined, and the idea of being responsible for something so big made him anxious. But he also knew there was no turning back. He couldn't hide behind the shadows of life on the streets anymore. He had something to prove, not just to Ethan, but to himself. Ethan led him to a room at the back, where the environment was more private. The muffled sounds of the kitchen and customers' conversations seemed distant, as if that space were a capsule, isolated from the daily routine. It was there in that small refuge that Ethan wanted to make his revelation, something that would set a new direction for the restaurant, and consequently for David. "David," Ethan began, now with a serious expression, "what I'm about to offer you is much bigger than you can imagine. This restaurant, well, it's my legacy, but it's about to be more than just good food and good service. It's going to be a beacon for those in need, a light in the darkness for people like you, like me, and like so many others who have passed and still struggle in life. I want you to be the one responsible for that change." David, surprised and a bit stunned, looked at Ethan. He never imagined someone like him, someone who had been on the streets, invisible to society, would be invited to lead something so grand. He didn't know what to say, and the words failed him once again. "But what do you want from me?" David asked, almost hesitantly. "I want you to be the general manager of Lux Beastro, David. Not just a regular manager, but someone who brings a new vision to this place. I want you to lead our transformation mission, to take care of not just the operation but the essence of this restaurant. Not just another exclusive place for a few, but a place of welcome where everyone, regardless of their background or condition, can find a piece of humanity." David remained silent, processing each word from Ethan. He never imagined that one day he would have the chance to be something more. He had always been the invisible man, someone no one noticed, someone who lived on the margins. But now he was being invited to be responsible for something that could change many lives, including his own. "I know you're not completely sure what to do with all of this yet," Ethan said, interrupting David's thoughts. "But I want you to know that I'm here to support you. It won't be easy, but I know you have the qualities needed to transform this place." David looked at Ethan, now with a different feeling. What began as a simple act of compassion was transforming into a huge responsibility. But he also felt that this was the chance of his life. He knew he couldn't let it slip away. Ethan placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, and his voice, now softer, echoed again. "The first step is to start. You already know what it takes to lead, and what you don't know, you'll learn along the way. But remember, your story doesn't end here, David. You have the power to change the lives of others, and when that happens, you'll realize that the real transformation starts within you." David took a deep breath. He didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was clear. He was ready to start his journey. He was no longer alone. He was no longer the man who walked in the shadows. He now had a purpose, a direction. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that the future still had something to offer. Ethan paused, seeing the transformation beginning to take shape within David. He knew that David's decision was just the beginning of something much bigger. Lux Beastro would no longer be just a restaurant. It would be a symbol of hope, of change, and of a new chance for those who needed a refuge. "Let's make history together," Ethan said, with a smile that left no room for doubt. David, with eyes shining with new determination, responded with a simple word, but one full of meaning. Yes. And so David's journey as the general manager of Lux Beastro began, not just a journey of professional change but of personal transformation, which would reverberate in the lives of everyone who entered that restaurant. David's first days at Lux Beastro weren't easy. When he took on the role of general manager, it wasn't just the responsibility of the restaurant that he carried. He felt the weight of a second chance, something he never thought he'd have. Each step on the new path he was walking felt like a constant struggle against the past, against the fear of failing, and above all, against the doubt that he could really change his life and the lives of others. But Ethan Grant didn't leave him alone. The CEO was always nearby, guiding him, offering advice, and most importantly, showing David the true meaning of leadership. It wasn't just about being the boss of a restaurant. It was about being the person who inspired those around him, who led by example, and who showed the value of compassion and care. In the first few months, Lux Beastro experienced visible changes. The food, of course, remained excellent, as it always had been, but there was a new energy in the air, an energy that came from the change in philosophy, vision, and heart. David wasn't just focused on the quality of the meal served. He wanted more. He wanted every customer who walked through those doors to feel that it was a place where everyone was welcome, regardless of their social standing, appearance, or where they came from. He started to change the way the restaurant interacted with the surrounding community. He reached out to local organizations that supported people experiencing homelessness, offering free meals to those in need. But David didn't want to be just a man giving charity. He wanted to offer dignity, and that meant more than just feeding someone. He wanted to create an environment where everyone, even the most vulnerable, had a space to feel respected. Each day at the restaurant brought new lessons, new opportunities for growth. The team, initially skeptical of the idea of changing the restaurant so much, began to see the changes, not only in the work environment but in their own attitudes. The old habits of judgment were replaced by a climate of mutual support. David made it a point to care for each of his employees as he would want to be cared for. He knew that a good leader wasn't the one who just demanded performance, but the one who inspired and cared for his team. The transformation wasn't immediate, but slowly, Lux Beastro became more than just a chic restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. It became a symbol of change, not only for its customers but for the community as a whole. People who once looked at the restaurant as an unreachable place now saw it as a refuge, a place where they could find support, understanding, and a warm meal. During this time, Ethan observed from a distance, not interfering. He trusted David more than he had ever trusted anyone before. He knew that his decision to give David a chance was the most important decision he had ever made in his life. The growth the restaurant was experiencing wasn't just visible in its revenue, but in how the community was beginning to feel connected to the place. But the deepest impact, undoubtedly, was on David. He felt his own transformation accelerating. He was no longer the man who hid in the shadows, someone who had no control over what happened in his life. He now had the responsibility to care for others, to be an example of overcoming. And as he did this, something incredible happened. He started to find himself again. Every smile he received, every thank you from a customer who felt welcomed, made his self-esteem grow. He had found, in the small actions of everyday life, the courage to keep going. One night, while walking through the restaurant's kitchen, observing the chefs working and the waiters serving tables, David stopped for a moment, stepping away from everything. He felt a wave of gratitude, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked around, seeing the happy faces of his co-workers, the delicious smell of the dishes being prepared, and realized he had found a purpose. But still, David knew his journey was far from over. He couldn't just rest and think he had reached his goal. He wanted more. He wanted to expand the vision he had for Lux Beastro, to transform the restaurant not only into a place that served the community, but into a benchmark for all the other restaurants in the city. He wanted the world to see Lux Beastro as an example of how business could be done with a heart, with purpose, and with a commitment to the well-being of all, without exception. David's transformation was closely watched by Ethan, but the CEO knew that the real credit wasn't his. It belonged to David himself. He saw how David's effort, determination, and humanity began to change not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. He was no longer a homeless man. He was a leader, someone who inspired others to believe in change. 3 months later, Lux Beastro had become much more than a restaurant. It had become a home for those who needed it most, a place of support, and somewhere everyone could feel valued. The meals served there were not just about food. They were about compassion, respect, and the beauty of giving a second chance. And for David, that small step of accepting Ethan's help was, in fact, the biggest leap he could ever imagine. He was no longer the man walking alone in the dark streets of life. He was now at the center of something bigger, something that truly made a difference. Lux Beastro was now a different place. 3 months had passed since David took on his new role as general manager, and the changes were more than evident. It wasn't just about good food or a welcoming atmosphere, but about something that transcended the plates and the customers. The restaurant had now become a living symbol of transformation, not just for those who visited, but for everyone who had the opportunity to be part of its story. For David, the changes weren't only in the restaurant, but within himself. He never imagined he could come this far, never imagined that a simple act of compassion could be the key to opening the doors to a future that seemed distant. He was no longer the man who lived in the shadows, fighting for every shred of dignity. Now he was someone who had a voice, who had a mission, and who knew he could help others find what he had found: a second chance. As the restaurant became more inclusive, the team also began to shift in a different way. Ethan's words, that message about treating everyone with respect and dignity, became deeply rooted in the culture of Lux Beastro. Every waiter, every cook, every team member felt that they were part of something bigger. It wasn't just a job, it was a mission. They were all committed to the well-being of the community, helping not only the customers but each other. But deep down, David knew there was still much more to be done. Lux Beastro was now a beacon of hope for the homeless, a place where food wasn't the only thing served. Dignity, humanity, and respect had become the main ingredients. He knew his fight wasn't over, but what he had built so far filled him with an indescribable satisfaction. He felt that he had found his true purpose in life. On one of the busiest days at the restaurant, Ethan walked in, observing everything with a satisfied smile. He saw David at the center of the operation, coordinating the staff with a serene and respectful authority, conversing with customers and offering not just quality service but also a sense of warmth. Ethan knew that real change was happening there, and it wasn't just in how the restaurant operated, but in how the people who walked through those doors felt. "You've done more than I imagined, David," Ethan said, stopping next to him, his voice full of pride. "This place is now a reflection of what you represent. You didn't just transform this restaurant, but the lives of so many people who needed an opportunity. You're more than a manager. You're a leader." David looked at Ethan, eyes shining, and responded with a humility he didn't even know he still had. "I only did what anyone would do, Ethan. Everyone deserves a chance. What you gave me was the opportunity to believe in myself again. I couldn't have done any of this without you." And as Ethan smiled, seeing that his faith in David had been more than justified, he knew that the restaurant was no longer what he had created. It had become David's project, the project of everyone who worked there and of all those who, even if they weren't physically present, had been touched by the story of the man who had once been invisible. But the impact of David at Lux Beastro didn't stop within the restaurant's walls. The success of the model of inclusion and welcome began to spread. Other restaurants in the city started looking at Lux Beastro as an example. They saw that a place that treated its employees and customers with respect and humanity could not only be successful, but a true force for transformation in the community. Meanwhile, in the restaurant, David was busier than ever. He was no longer the man on the fringes of society, but someone whose actions were creating a real impact. He read books on leadership, talked to people who had lived through situations similar to his, and each day, he felt more confident that he had found his place in the world. He was no longer the former homeless man, but now the manager of one of the most respected restaurants in the city. He was now a symbol of change, not only for those who knew him, but for all those who saw him as someone who had overcome adversity in a remarkable way. "You know, when you started here, I had no idea what you could do with this place," Ethan said to David in a conversation they had later. "But now I see that you're the true heart of this restaurant. Without you, none of this would have been possible." David smiled, now more mature, more self-assured. He knew his journey was still ongoing, but he no longer feared what the future would bring. He had found something more important than any position or recognition. He had found purpose. He knew that from here on out, his life would have a real impact on the lives of others. He would be remembered, not as the man who walked the streets, but as the man who helped transform a restaurant and a community. And so, Lux Beastro continued to thrive, not just as a luxury restaurant, but as a symbol of compassion and change. And David's story, the man who once was invisible, was now intertwined with the story of Ethan and all those who believed that kindness still had a role to play in the world. The real transformation, David knew, wasn't just about changing one person's life, but inspiring others to believe that change was always possible. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next ones. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the choices made by the characters? Do you agree with how things unfolded, or would you have done something different? Drop your opinion in the comments below.